Do you remember the moment the COVID-19 pandemic became real for you? For me, it was a weekend shift at the Toronto Star. It was mid-March, and I was on night reporting duties. That evening, Tim Hortons, Canada's favorite coffee shop, was in the news for asking workers to get a doctor's note to take an unpaid sick day. I was thinking about what it meant to have to choose between a day's income, your health, and the safety of customers you were serving food to. And I was also thinking about the food itself, because a couple of years earlier, I'd spent a month working undercover at an industrial bakery that counted Tim Hortons amongst its clients. And while our favorite coffee shops were about to be shut down for months, the factories that supplied them would be deemed an essential service. By now, we've all heard the term essential worker. For me, the term describes many of the jobs I've spent my career writing about. I was hired 6 years ago as the Toronto Star's labor reporter. At that time, and still to this day, the Star is the only mainstream media outlet in Canada to have a full-time position dedicated to covering these issues. So many of these jobs are truly invisible. We don't see the people picking our crops or the people processing and packing that food. Many of us barely even notice the Uber Eats driver dropping off the final product. This reality has significant implications. Through my journalism, I've learned that the growth of jobs in which workers have little voice and power impacts everyone, and visibility for these workers is crucial to keeping our society healthy. Now, in the middle of a pandemic, it's more crucial than ever. I want to rewind to before pandemic times and ask you to think about the last time you sat in a coffee shop munching on a pastry. For me, this used to be an almost reflexive activity, one that I'd never think twice about, until I ended up as a temp agency worker on a deafening and crammed production line, folding raw pastry into croissants destined for companies like Tim Hortons. I wanted to understand the impact of precarious work on workers themselves. So I started digging through court records, and I found a factory, a significant employer in the area, that was heavily reliant on temporary labor. It takes bravery for anyone to speak out about their employer, but for low-wage workers with little job security, putting that job on the line to tell your story is sometimes next to impossible. So after conversations with my lawyers and editors at the Star, we decided that getting a job at the factory myself was the best and really only way to tell the story properly. So I showed up at the factory one day and told them I was looking for a job. They gave me a number for a temp agency, and they told me what day to show up at the plant. In the lead up, I felt incredibly nervous. But once I started working, there was really no time for jitters. Along with my new colleagues, I got about 5 minutes health and safety training, and off I went to a frenzied production line where my main preoccupation was just keeping up with the ferocious pace of work. I was paid minimum wage in cash, wages that I picked up at a payday lender. 5 temp agency workers at this company have died in industrial accidents. Ivan Golyashov was 17 when he was crushed to death by a dough mixer. Amina Diaby was a refugee hoping to become a nurse when she died after her headscarf got stuck in a faulty conveyor belt. Enrico Miranda was a trained engineer working as a cleaner when he was crushed to death by a machine. And 2 other workers were hit by transport trucks. I worked at this factory for a month. After my last shift, I got into my car expecting to feel relief. Instead, I felt an enormous weight on my chest. For me, taking this job and leaving it were choices. But for thousands of workers in survival jobs across the city, these choices are non-existent. If you're in one of these jobs, what I'm describing might sound familiar. Or you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with me? Fast forward to the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of our coverage, my colleague at the Star and I began investigating a massive outbreak. It happened at an industrial bakery not far from the one I'd worked at. It's again a significant employer that hires over 2,000 Torontonians to make the pastries we buy at the grocery store. 184 workers at this company tested positive for the virus. One died. None of this was reported to the public by health authorities. The workers I spoke to said the company was reliant on temporary workers who often didn't feel comfortable speaking up about safety issues, workers who sometimes didn't have a paid sick day or couldn't afford to stay at home if they felt ill, workers who were juggling multiple jobs. What this outbreak showed us was that it was no longer possible to draw a sharp line between what's happening behind factory doors and what's happening in the broader community. COVID-19 is the most powerful example that we are all connected. Our city is only as safe as its most vulnerable residents who, in policy decisions and civic conversation, are often invisible. This kind of work may feel distant to you, but for many, it is a way of life. In the Greater Toronto Area and Hamilton, around half of us are now in jobs with some degree of precarity, whether that's hopping contract to contract or not having access to a pension or benefits. Even before the pandemic, precarious work had implications for our families, our healthcare system, our very social fabric. Yet so often, we don't talk about it. In families, especially immigrant families, there's often a cone of silence around our work lives, spaces that are essential to putting food on the table, but can sometimes make us feel small, isolated, or powerless. We're taught to feel grateful for having a job, and I understand why. Jobs don't just put food on the table. They shape our identity, our purpose, our sense of community. But what the pandemic showed us was that so many of these jobs that have so long been undervalued, jobs in which workers often feel silenced or invisible, are actually crucial to how our society functions. So how do we make the invisible visible? I'd like to encourage you to do something very simple. Start talking about work. That might mean seeking out more stories in the media about jobs that you previously thought had little to do with you. Or it might mean starting to talk about how you feel about work. Do you feel comfortable asking for a sick day? Can you stop checking your emails on the weekend? Is there a lingering sense of guilt? If so, ask yourself why. It wasn't until I started my job as a labor reporter that I heard from my dad, who immigrated from Iran, about how he used to work such long hours at a plastics factory that he'd sometimes just sleep on the shop floor until his next shift. It wasn't until I started delving into these issues as a journalist that I began to understand the true toll of my mom's erratic schedule as a low-wage caregiver. Having these conversations can mean huge personal revelations, and they may inform the way you see the world on a bigger level. They may change the way you perceive and value your own work and the work of those around you. And that might be good for all of us.